Alright guys, so it's been 2 days since the expansion and I figured it was finally time to sit down. I don't want to have just these theory crafted decks on my site just any longer, so I decided this is it. It's time to sit down and make an actual proper tier list that has some substantiated value. So here's the problem at the beginning of a patch. It's because, you know, it takes probably playing like 8+ hours of a deck to really properly refine it and get the feel that it's the best version of that archetype. And, you know, we just simply haven't had enough time in the past 48 hours for any person to really do that on their own for any sort of like specific, you know, more than just 1 or 2 decks. So I basically have been talking to a bunch of other people. I sat down for like 4 or 5 hours today and have gotten a bunch of opinions from different top level players about what, you know, kinds of decks that they're gonna what kind of versions they've been building, what kind of versions they've been liking. And here we have for you the day 2 actual like meta report tier list. So to break a couple of things down, well, why is there only tier 1 and tier 2? Well, at the start of a meta game, basically we don't have any sort of like granularity or refinement. We don't have any stats. It's impossible to say exactly like how good certain things are because tiers are all about, you know, oh, does my deck beat X deck of a high tier, right? And it's a very complex ecosystem. At the start, all we really have is this deck is really good or this deck is pretty good, maybe high potential, right? So we don't, you know, as things go on, we'll be able to split into like 3 or 4 total tiers of viability. And lastly, I'll mention before we actually get into, you know, the deck list themselves, this is a really weird meta, right? Specifically, we're seeing some cards that have just exploded in power and viability that were just on nobody's radar. Literally nobody's radar. Or I mean, maybe you looked at some of these cards. You know, there's got to be a couple of you guys out there that will be able to look through this list and retroactively be like, I told you so. I expect to see this in the comments. Like, Swim, here, I'm going to give you guys a spoiler, okay? Here's what it is. Here's what you're going to say in the comments. Swim, I knew the first time I looked at Icequake that this card would be a 3 of meta decider. Obviously, this was the case. You didn't see that coming, yeah? So this is going to be a very interesting tier list to break down. As always, check out the pinned comment because I'm going to be updating all of the deck codes there, and that's going to be important because I can't update the video, but if you want the up-to-date versions, check out the pinned comment. All right, let's just go ahead and get us started with Ezreal Targon. So Ezreal Targon, if you watch me on Twitch, you'll have seen me play this deck for almost the entirety of the second day of the expansion. I set aside and I just optimized Ezreal Targon. This is what I came up with for my version of Ezreal Targon. I think that this is the best Ezreal deck in the game right now, at the very least until, you know, the meta responds in a very powerful way to Hush. We're going to see probably a big shift as people start to, you know, kind of like target it with specific lineups. And until then, at the very least, Ezreal Targon is going to be the best way to play Ezreal. I'm going to be playing in a tournament tomorrow. Well, it's tomorrow for me. If you're watching this, it's later today for you. And that's going to be it's going to be at 2 p.m. Pacific, and I'm going to be playing it on stream. So, you know, maybe I'm playing it right now if you're watching this, and you can check it out if you want. And I'm personally planning on bringing Ezreal Targon. At this current point in time, it's a 2-deck format, and I'm personally planning, and I might switch off because I do have some prep time before then, but I think I'll probably bring this deck. It performed very well for me today, and the idea behind this deck is really simple. Like every Ezreal deck, we're going to be basically stalling out the game and just kind of like waiting until we get to the end where Ezreal's flipped and then blow them out with kind of the full combo and a lot of spells. There's a couple of cards here that are going to be really surprising to some of you guys. But let's go ahead and just kind of start with the basics. So we've got kind of our early game, Spacey Sketchers, Zona Urchin, you know, Flame Chompers, Mentor of Shadows. We ended up running 1 Flame Chompers instead of the Jury Rig slot. This was Precipix's idea. Actually pretty genius because Flame Chompers, unlike Jury Rig, has a great synergy with something like Mentor of the Stones. And even sometimes your big 8/8 dinosaur just slaps them in the face off of your challenger. It actually just ends up being a little bit better than Jury Rig in this deck. Okay, so next up, let's get to some of the more kind of interesting choices in the deck. Well, we're running 3 Hush. Hush is a super good card. I will say, as the meta responds, this deck could cut down to 2 Hush. Hush is not a 3 of card. This is the only deck in the entire game where you can or should be running 3 Hush. Every other, like, Hush is a great card, but every other deck should be running like 2 Hush or 1 Hush. Ezreal, this deck can run 3 Hush. The reason for that is because, of course, it targets opponents' units, which is great. It's going to be, you know, because it helps level up Ezreal. It spells, so it can damage off of Ezreal. It helps kind of like survive any sort of end game combo. You can always stop your opponent's win condition with Hush, which is great. But it also levels up your Tri-Beam Improbulator. Bet you didn't see this one coming. This is a card that ended up being extremely competitive, and I'm loving it in this deck. This is actually super low key in this Ezreal deck. We run a really good amount of these like 3 mana cards off of Hush, Solari Priestess, Mentor of the Stones, and off of a couple of Get Exciteds as well. And even the Ezreal's 3 mana, so it'll work as well. And all you need to do is just play like 2 or 3 cards for this to end up being like a super great game swinger in the mid game, right? Basically, you know, when this deals 4, your opponent will just kind of like lose to it, because for 4 mana you're dealing 4 and summoning a 4 cost unit, and there's not really a big way they can come back from that in the mid game. As much as I love this card, it is probably going to be a 2F here. I can't really justify 3, especially because it'll start leading to some clunky hands, but this card is an actual difference maker in this deck. Do not underestimate Tri-Beam Improbulator. And lastly, the hot thing about this deck is we are running the Infinite Ear Splitter. This is a card that I really underrated at first. It's actually seeing a ton of like competitive play. People are running it in a lot of slow Targon decks. And in this case, we're going to be running it as a one-of just because it's not as good with like the Ezreal game plan. Now, we do get to have 2 targets, which is great. I love drawing this card, but it's not really something you want to be double drawing very often. So in this case, a one-of, I could see it being a 2. And basically, the idea behind this card is it's actually just surprisingly hard to deal with. You know, against like any sort of strategy that has a board developed, they're basically just getting 2 of their units straight up deleted. And the 8 mana 8/8 stat, I mean the 8/8 stat line is just very difficult to deal with. So it's a card that I'm very happy to be running in this deck. All right, next up we've got Sol Ramp. This is Trundle Sol, and this is a very interesting build of the deck. So basically, Precipic and Alan have both been playing a good amount of this deck, and we kind of like sat down and ended up tweaking out this version together. Now, this is a very powerful deck, and I can tell you right now, this is the best version of this deck, at least compared to like other ones that, you know, we're seeing on ladder. Maybe it'll see some refinement over the next couple of days. It's not 100% solved, but this is way better than anything on ladder right now. So I'm gonna start with like the basic game plan of this build, which is it is a ramp deck. Ramp means we're kind of cheating out mana early while just kind of like playing big dudes. So for example, the very common play is you'll play Weirding Stones on turn 3, and you're going to follow that up with a Trundle on turn 4, because Weirding Stones gives you an extra mana crystal early, so you can play Trundle a turn earlier than you normally could. Pretty straightforward. This ultimately, you know, culminates in you playing like stuff like Infinite Mind Splitter as well as Aurelion Sol a little bit earlier than you normally would be able to as well, and we have that off of the back of Catalyst of Eons that gives us a gem in addition to Weirding Stones. So the game plan is pretty straightforward. We plan on trying to close out the game with like the kind of infinite value engine that is Aurelion Sol. So, you know, that's pretty good. And we have a bunch of ways to just kind of like stay alive, right? Infinite Mind Splitter is very good, especially when you can cheat it out just a little bit early, and it's a great, you know, behold target as well for some of this deck. And of course, you know, we've got Trundle, which is an early cheap defensive regen. We've got Troll Ravager is like a mini Trundle. It's like great defensive regen. Tarkaz, defensive body. Kindly Tavern Keeper is going to heal you, and man, oh man, does this deck have heals. We've got Star Shaping, heal you 5. Catalyst, heal you 3. We've got Revitalizing Roar, which usually ends up healing you 10. This deck will basically just maintain its health super high the entire game. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. We have to talk about Icequake. So Icequake has defied everybody's expectations. Basically, we all thought this card was just going to be just like jank at the start, and what happened was, you know, people are playing Trundle Sol decks, and when they draw the second Trundle and it turns into an Icequake, they're like, wow, this actually feels pretty good. So we started main decking it. And main deck Icequake is even better than the Icequake off the Trundle. You know why? Because we can play this on turn 4, and we often do. This so often So often the opponent's developing tempo, it's like, you know, they're Lulu Demacia or whatever. They got Fleet Feather Tracker, they got Bright Steel Protector, they got Lulu. You know, we're on Wording Stones on turn 3. We skipped the first 2 turns, and we just Icequake on turn 4. And they have nothing. Everything is just completely dead. I know it sounds so stupid to say this. But Precipic, like, he's, like, basically, his words exactly, it's the stupidest thing ever, but paying 4 mana compared to Avalanche for the 1 extra damage is completely worth it. I know, look, listen, I know some of you guys think I'm trolling right now, but this is 100% worth it. So, a couple of things. Like, the breakpoint between 2 and 3 is really, really big. And also, you know, anything that gets left alive is going to be dealing a little less damage. That does actually matter. But the biggest reason this is because of Runeterra's, like, alternating action system. The fact that Icequake only costs 1 action makes it completely okay that it costs more mana here. Because the opponent will still kind of be screwed for a development. It will, for most intents and purposes, it will be an 8 mana ruination in a lot of games. Icequake is beyond good. Icequake is straight up meta defining. Absolutely scary card. And I gotta say, the amount of healing that this deck has is what I think scares me the most about it. Because normally we've got this kind of like good old meta triangle, right? And you can see this is the one on my site, and this is kind of like how I define these concepts. People have very slightly different definitions. But, you know, we've got aggro beats combo, combo beats control, and control beats aggro, right? It makes sense. And mid-range is kind of on the spectrum between aggro and control here. So it's like, you know, control is just survivability with late game. Combo sacrifices survivability for punch through, right? And, you know, obviously a deck like control is kind of meant to beat a deck like aggro. Makes perfect sense. Here's the scary thing about this deck, which is that combo is supposed to beat control, right? And this deck is, I mean, this is how this deck loses. It's supposed to lose, you know, because it doesn't put out enough pressure. You know, we don't really have a fast win condition. Our ASOL is going to be slow. It's going to be clunky. It's going to take several turns to win. So this deck is supposed to lose to like an Ezreal deck, but it has so much healing that I don't know if it really does. And that kind of scares me, because that's when you engineer some of the strongest decks possible. When decks find a way to cheat their weakness in the rock, paper, scissors triangle, that is absolutely terrifying. This is a very, very good deck. All right. Next up, we've got Night and Day. So this is also pretty hot. Look at this. We have a Nightfall and Daybreak deck. I was saying at first, you know what? It seems unlikely that there's going to be enough reason to run these two concepts together, because it just feels kind of like, I mean, you know, without a reason to run Nightfall and Daybreak together, they're sort of like mismatched. But it turns out if you want to run the Allegiance version of Targon, the best bet is to just go deep into this strategy. So you might have seen in our kind of like, you know, these are 11 decks for the new patch. We had a couple of decks that were running the Allegiance one. One was running Braum as a version, and the other was running Encroaching Shadows. Now, we tossed around a lot of ideas and versions, but the idea I like the most is this one, where we run 2 Omen Hawks and 1 Fury of the North. And the rest of our cards are just pure Targon, of course. Why is this? So Braum ultimately isn't as effective in this meta, and the champ slot is better given to Diana here, which is going to kind of help supplement a lot of the like game plan of this deck, right? Pale Cascade, absolutely crazy card. This card is just really, really, really good. And we've got a lot of like good value free Nightfall cards as well. Also, a really important thing to note, Lunari Duskbringer is absolutely great in this deck, because not only is it enabling, you know, it's enabling stuff like Priestess and Diana, which is really nice sometimes, but oftentimes you're just discarding the petal with your Spacey Sketcher. And that's crazy. That's a crazy combo. When you look at this as a 1 mana 2/1, just create a discard target, that becomes really insane in any deck that wants to play aggressively for tempo. So we have this very tempo heavy sort of like kind of like mid-range shell, because we do have a lot of, you know, these cheap bodies, but they're invoking some things. We're never really going to run out of steam. So then we ask ourselves, okay, what's the best splash? And my answer to that is Omen Hawk. Omen Hawk at 1 mana, it seems kind of crazy. Look at this, we already have 9 1-drops, right? Here's the thing, Spacey Sketcher isn't really a 1-drop. You're not playing her on turn 1, really. She's kind of just the cycle card for later. But also, because this deck generates so many free cards, every invoke, you're drawing cards, you don't really run out of cards. So your lose condition often ends up being, you know, kind of like getting out tempoed, right? And what better tool for that than Omen Hawk? If it hits a buff on some of these relevant targets, like buffing the champions is really insane. Buffing pretty much anything for value here is going to be great, like Solari Soldier, Mountain Scryer, or Ravon Daylight Spear is perfectly fine. You just can never really go wrong with a couple of Omen Hawks for value. So this is ultimately, after all the trial and error, this is my answer for my personal version of the like Targon Allegiance deck identity. And yeah, it does happen to be using Nightfall and Daybreak. They're not as so much synergistic together, but they kind of represent the best independent value that Targon has, right? It's kind of the best way to run just a value archetype because they both bring the two halves of value together. So another super powerful deck. Let's continue. In the slightly more boring realm of things, we've got MF Scouts. I decided, you know what, this isn't just going to be a new decks page. It's going to try to be an actual tier list. So, I'm obviously gearing this towards newer decks for the time being because, I have to. That's what everyone's playing. But MF Scouts is showing up on ladder and, hey, it's pretty good. It's a great deck to be playing right now in the meta if you want to play sort of like an aggro-y, tempo-y kind of concept that doesn't lose to Hush. This is kind of your answer. The really big thing about this deck is basically you just slam beef, you slam it very aggressively. It's a very classic, old school, like Demacia Bannerman style deck. Hasn't really seen basically any change at all from the last patch, but it's been performing very well on ladder. So, like I said, it's a bit vanilla, especially if you come from like older versions of the game. This is kind of like less exciting because it's been around the block, but it still proves to be a really great deck right now, especially because right now the meta just demands you get rewarded so much from playing an aggressive tempo deck that doesn't get blown up by Hush. Anything that fits that description is going to be very well positioned in the current meta. All right, so next we got Swain TF. Now this is Rattling Bones' version of Swain TF, and again, this is kind of a classic deck. This is a deck that is not really seeing changes from the update. There's not really like big new cards that you would necessarily want to be running here, and that's totally fine. Swain TF is a very well positioned deck. I've been seeing it a little bit on ladder and usually to good results. It's a deck that hasn't really gotten nerfed from the patch. You have a very legitimate win condition in your kind of like control identity. So the game plan is basically just kind of like stall out the game, make sure your opponent isn't really able to, kill you, and you're just blocking with your House Spider, you're stunning with your Arachnoid Sentry, and meanwhile, you're just like controlling the board while leveling your Swain, and eventually, you'll play the Leviathan on turn 8, you'll play the Swain if you don't already have it on turn 9, and that's about all she wrote. Swain is a pretty classic control concept. All you need to do is just like pick off a few units, stay alive, Leviathan on 8, Swain on 9, and usually that'll about have closed out the game. TF is a great flexible card here, and a large part of like where the skill representation of this deck comes from, because knowing whether to use him for, one effect or another, depending on whether you want blue card or red card or gold card, is going to kind of make the difference between a good Swain TF player and a bad one, but also knowing when you should kind of go out of your way to try to level up your TF, right? Because you're not always going to have the ability to do that, but every once in a while that can end up being a win condition. He can level up spookily fast if you've got a hand for it. All right, and lastly, we've got Tempo Lulu. Now, this one's kind of like lower ranked among the tier 1 decks. I still need to figure this one out a little bit. I need to mess around with Lulu a lot more. I feel like this champion actually has a lot of potential that I just haven't quite given her enough attention, and I need to experiment more with like Targon and Nox's versions of Lulu, but I have found great success. If you watched my stream on day 1, you'll have seen it with the Lulu Demacia build, and this is my current preferred version. Now, unlike the stream, if you happen to have seen some of those games, we've actually since put in a couple of copies of Laurent Bladekeeper. Seems kind of weird, but ends up doing a really good job when it buffs either Lulu or Zed. As a turn 4 play to buff one of your champions is really great, because getting a +2/+2 on either champ goes a really long way. Sometimes even buffing like a young witch for some kind of like elusive win condition is going to be a really good way Bladekeeper plays. But the idea behind this deck is really straightforward. It's got all the like just general curve play values of Demacia, Demacia, but you also have a lot of the kind of like support value that the Lulu side of things brings. So it's all about the openers with this deck, and it's all about the mulligan. This is a very, very fast deck that will kind of like, the Nexus won't be dead, but the game will feel very one-sided from like turn 3 or 4, right? It's like you play Fleet Feather Tracker on turn 1, then you're followed up with either a Brightsteel Protector or sometimes a Young Witch. There's nothing wrong with just Young Witching it, and hey, you've got, you know, basically a free kill. You abuse barriers, quick attacks, and challengers to just get free kills, and Fleet Feather Tracker is really kind of like the core of this entire strategy here. Like, Fleet Feather Tracker allows... It's nuts with Brightsteel Protector, it's nuts with Warchefs, it's nuts with Young Witch, and it's nuts with Lulu. Because when you, challenge something with Lulu, you get a 4/4 tracker that will kill anything at that stage of the game and also survive against anything at that stage in the game, which is really, really, really powerful. In fact, it's so good that we're even running some Blinding Assault, which summons Valor. Valor's the, it's the same thing as Fleet Feather Tracker, but it's got Scout as well. Usually that's not worth paying an additional piece of mana for, but in this case, there's actually a lot that Valor does for this deck. Again, it just hits all the same things. It's a, challenger, it's a cheap challenger, so you can combine it with Quick Attack, you can combine it with the support, or, the big Lulu support. But something very unique to Blinding Assault is its interaction with this spell right here, Rush. Rush is really, really adorable. I can't tell you how many games I won off of this combo where I would just play Valor, and if my opponent doesn't have a way to deal with the Valor, I just rush it. And I can kill 2 things for free. Rush gives it 1 attack and quick attack for the entire round. So Valor, because it has Scout, it can attack once, kill something with quick attack for free, because it's got Challenger too, and then attack again, and it'll still have the Rush quick attack. That's really powerful, and that's something that Rush can do that Young Witch can't do, because you can't attack twice with Young Witch's support, because support would cancel out the Scout. So the 1 Rush finds a really nice quaint home in this deck. It's also a great trick if, you're attacking with Lulu and the opponent has a decent blocker. You can rush it out and make their block feel really, really bad very, very fast. Okay, next up, we've got tier 2 decks. Now, a lot of these decks are kind of in tier 2 just because of Hush's position in the meta right now. So, kind of how Precipic and I decided on, like, the tier list is basically decks that don't really have a way to win against Hush kind of can't really be tier 1, right? Hush isn't like insanely common in every deck. It's a card that like pretty much every Targon deck is running some quantity of, but I mean Targon's just one region. The problem is there's a lot of decks that actually have basically no chance of winning if the opponent has a Hush. Like for example, Taric Lee Sin is a pretty powerful deck, but like against even a single Hush, it doesn't really have a great win condition, and that kind of deck just can't really be long-term tier 1. Okay, so a lot of those will end up in tier 2. For those of you guys who are wondering, that's why decks like Vehu Endure that might feel very strong kind of can't be long-term tier 1 right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off with Elusive Shadowcombo. This is a pretty gross deck. Basically, this is the deck that runs Encroaching Shadows and Stalking Shadows and combines their identities with Elusives. And yeah, this deck is not really going to be able to be tier 1 with Hush. I do think that it's going to be exactly hard to say what the best version of a long-term Elusives deck will be and whether it will be able to maintain its position in Shadow Isles or not. I do think that it's got a really great shot in a shell like this. I'll have to come back and try to refine this concept a little bit more when Hush is out, because I do think the deck is currently built a little too combo-y. I love the Shadow Isles direction, but we could actually get a little bit away from like the dependency on the full combo and run something that has a little bit more of like a mid-range value package instead. The thing about Legends of Runeterra is there will kind of always be an elusive deck in the meta. Like it's always just like, it always has a niche to fill. It's always going to do really well against decks that are dependent on blocking. And the only question is, what will the elusive deck look like? Will it look like, the Shadow Isles full combo deck, or will it look like kind of like more of a sort of like balanced mid-range concept? And honestly, it's really hard to say right now. Neither of them is going to work super well in a Hush environment. What I will say is I don't love kind of like the meta health identity of an elusive concept. It does feel like when Hush gets nerfed, I'd like for something about this deck to get nerfed at the same time, because I know it might seem kind of weird. I know some of you guys might not have like felt too much from this deck, but I actually think that when played very well and when built with a refined concept, something like this is personally really scary to me. But the game plan of this deck is pretty straightforward. We're just kind of like stalling until we hit kind of our big combo. In this case, we are just trying to clone Greenglade Duo off of Fading Memories and Stalking Shadows. Sometimes we're cloning Navori Blade Scout. We're going to be keeping Navori Blade Scout and Encroaching Shadows in our hand. Don't get trapped into using these a little bit too early. This is kind of like a common bait for people that pick up the deck for the first time. You want to save these as combo pieces and make sure that you're using them on the turn that you're ending the game. Or Encroaching Shadows is usually the turn right before you move into end of the game from hand with your elusives. You can be playing a lot of the other elusives like earlier. You typically play Islander on like turn 1, Navori Conspirator or Duo on turn 2, and just kind of like start jamming in a little bit of value, and then save the rest of your hand up for the big elusive finish with Encroaching Shadows. This deck is basically known for its ability to ass pull a crazy amount of lethal out of nowhere. So like, forget about Encroaching Shadows, forget about Keeper of Masks. These are two big combo pieces. Even when you don't have a combo hand, even I can just play a Greenglade Duo, I can play a Fading Memories on the Greenglade Duo to make another Greenglade Duo, and then I can play like 2 Blade Scouts from hand, or I can Shadows and clone a Blade Scout and then play 2 Blade Scouts, right? So all I've done is played 2 Duos and 2 Blade Scouts, and that's 13 elusive damage. 13, just off of those cheap elusives. And that's just for 1 turn for 1 attack, without Keeper, without Encroaching. So this deck can very, very easily be dealing something like 20 to 0 in, super, super common hand. All right, so next up, we've got Taric Aggro. So this is sort of the next evolution in Taric Draven. Precipix's latest version has cut Draven and is running Diana instead for a little bit more kind of like reliable aggression with the Challenger. Basically, the idea here is this is just an aggro Taric deck. We're not trying to level the Taric, but his ability to clone these spells, in particular Might and Pale Cascade, are really, really, really strong. Combine that with a couple of just like early nut draws, like for example, super common hand, Startled Stomper plus even Mentor on turn 3. This elephant gets scary fast, man. When you have like an Overwhelm 4-5 on turn 3 permanent stats, that can get out of hand super quickly, or when you mentor Diana as well. So Mentor is obviously a really big power card in this list. And then as the finisher, you can play some Lunari Shadestalker towards the end when your opponent has stabilized, they've got blockers, go for an elusive kill, maybe with some of the plus damage spells we've got over here. So it's a kind of nice, well-rounded aggro deck concept. Definitely kind of more in the tier 2 category of things, but a solid deck nonetheless. Next up, we have Taric Lee Sin. Taric Lee Sin, a deck that I was actually playing quite a bit of, felt pretty good, but ultimately, obviously, the Hush meta definitely hurts it a little bit. The biggest problem with this deck is just the fact that it doesn't really have the ability to beat hands like that. Makes it like a little bit too clunky. The more I play this list, the more I ended up cutting down on Arbiters and replacing them with Spacey Sketchers to try to like get a little bit more additional like value in maintaining like early game presence, and that has definitely helped. But overall, yeah, this is a deck archetype that I think could be good pretty soon, because we do know in some amount of time, I think it was in the time frame of several weeks from now, they are planning on reworking Lee Sin to make him a little bit less clunky, and they're also almost certainly going to be tweaking Hush in some way. And as soon as that comes, I actually think this deck could end up being pretty low-key. I mean, we don't know exactly what we're doing with Lee Sin, but I think this deck is actually going to be quite a bit closer than people give it credit for. All right, reaching the end here, we've got another classic deck. This is another one that is largely unchanged with the new patch, which is They Who Endure. This is one of my kind of like favorite archetypes in the entire game. Just off the back of this one card, They Who Endure, feels very, very unique, right? So, you have kind of the typical aggro game plan of, I'm going to slap down the opponent super quickly. I'm going to rush them down. I've got Blighted Caretaker. I've got Cursed Keeper. And the idea behind this deck is, when that aggro plan kind of runs its course, we've got They Who Endure, and that's going to help you basically finish off opponents that are usually at low health from you just throwing a bunch of units at their face. So this is, depending on exactly like the different flexes, I would say this is a quintessential sort of like mid-range or aggro deck. It's very debatable, and it depends even on just like a couple of swaps. It could be classified very quickly as one or the other. But I'd call it a mid-range deck that has like a very prominent aggro draw. The idea here is that we're often combining Atrocity with They Who Endure in the late game. They Who Endure is usually going to be reaching like even 10 or more attack, and when we combine that with Atrocity, we have a nice like safe way of being able to, even if it gets stunned out or something, close out the game just with that big stat line. Overall, it's a pretty solid archetype. This is just kind of like one of the staple archetypes in Runeterra. It's not really going anywhere, but it does feel a little bit weaker into the Hush meta. This one, unlike some of the other decks down here, this one actually does have the ability to absolutely win against Hush, but the only problem is this card in particular, They Who Endure, feels very vulnerable to it. So most of the decks that this game is winning in matchups like that are off of the back of its very aggro Shadow Isles start with, you know, Cursed Keeper into Caretaker or into Butcher kinds of hands. I think that as people are going to play the next couple of days, they're going to refine more and more the best way to actually run this aggro SI package, and they'll probably have to replace the Freljord side of things. They're going to be combining it with different ways to close the game from either Noxus or Bilgewater, because this aggro Shadow Isles package has a lot excuse me. This aggro Shadow Isles package has a lot of potential, right? And is absolutely the thing that carries this deck the hardest. And finally, last but not least, we've got Poro Combo. This is a surprisingly decent deck. Like, zero irony. It's not tier 1 or anything, don't get me wrong. And yeah, this is going to have problems with Hush. But overall, this is actually not a bad deck. Poro Cannon is a really strong card. The ability to straight up just discard one, it costs 0 cards in hand because you are spending 2 cards and you're drawing 2 cards. It costs 0 mana and it costs 0 actions because it's a burst speed card. It has basically no cost. All you're doing is just transforming cards into Poros, and that is a very powerful ability. It has synergies with some spells, it has synergies with some discard effects, and of course it's got synergy with anything that works with Daring Poro, because that's what it gives you, Daring Poro. So it's going to do very well with Poro Snacks. It's going to do very well with Von Yip. Poro Herder is going to get you even more of the Daring Poros, and basically this deck will just play a ton of Daring Poros and just kind of kill the opponent with them. This is actually a surprisingly solid deck. Like, zero irony whatsoever. It's going to surprise you. I almost lost a game to this deck earlier today on my stream. Some of you guys will actually remember that. Some of you guys might have actually seen that game. And, you know, I thought I was going to lose, and then I drew Hush, and then their deck lost. But you know what? Man, they almost had me. It was really crazy how behind I felt that game. Like, I almost could do nothing about just like staring down a ton of really big Daring Poros. And yeah, that's basically it for the, you know, meta report, as it were. This is obviously, you know, we don't have any stats, so it's kind of harder to talk about that aspect of things, and it's still like early days, so it's hard for me to talk as in details about, like, you know, oh, this matchup is good against this, you know, that sort of thing. Mostly we can just talk about, oh, this deck seems good, or oh, this deck seems, you know, less good, and talk about consistency and stuff. But as we keep going, as the meta develops, I'm going to be updating this every single day. I'm going to be adding new decks to this, and next time we do this video, which will be sometime next week, it'll be within 7 days. It'll be earlier next week, and we are going to have actual like 3 different tiers to be able to kind of like break down as the meta starts to solidify, and we start to really seeing like the top things rising to the top, and the, like, you know, kind of more poo-poo things showing themselves for what they really are. All right, guys. Anyway, this has been a blast for me. I love just like playing around and seeing like all these new things perform. Some things just absolutely, you know, surprising everyone. It's always a ton of fun when, like, you know, card predictions go like this. And yeah, I can't wait to see what the next several days have in store, because this was just off of the first 48 hours. All right. Anyway, that's it for me this time. I'll see you guys next time.